Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room. I'm Robin Adair. With me, as always, my rumbling partner, John Juricic. Our guest, our special guest, as we lead up towards the Christmas season, is Rich Coleman, the former Deputy Premier and Minister of a number of important portfolios with the BC Liberals. And Rich, so great to have you on the show. So much to talk about.
Well, good to be here today with you guys.
Well, let's get right into it. There's so many things to pick, but let's talk about the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, the Indigenous Peoples Act, DRIPA as they call it, and it's now turned into something that has been done under the table, it sounds like, by the Premier's office. Even his own MLAs didn't know what was going on. We've just had a First Nations group say no to a mine. And we earlier, of course, had the band up in Cowichan say that they had rights to fishing and property on Lulu Island in Richmond, which is both private and Crown land. And so the precedent is, in some ways, is being set. The Conservatives are saying this whole DRIPA thing needs to be thrown out, this UN declaration, and the Premier says, no, we're just going to try to amend it. But I think it's a terrible mess. I know we've been trying to deal with our First Nations fairly. And when you came into government with Gordon Campbell, he really set out an agenda to go after helping them on a financial basis. Let's really raise the bar for the financial well-being of our First Nations. And that seemed to be effective. What do you make of what's happened now, and how do we get out of this?
Well, let's be clear about a couple of things. First of all, the first piece, which was the UN Declaration, which is more of a celebration and recognition of First Nations under the United Nations, that wasn't codified as being part of a law, something that would go into case law. The NDP have done something with another piece of legislation that seems to have codified some things, and it's now being interpreted by the courts in a way that I think is damaging for the future of the economy for all of us, our First Nations, us alike. So I think bottom line is they need to go in and amend it, pull it back and redo it. But the reality, they're having unintended consequences of some legislation they've done. And that unintended consequences has significant complications for all of us in BC because, people aren't going to invest in here if they don't know there's certainty. The First Nations won't get investment either if there isn't certainty. And the reality is it could put us into a bit of a neutral area as far as economic development and jobs, which is just a bad time to have this happen, quite frankly.
Right, neutral. Coming from bad to neutral. These guys, these NDP folks, they couldn't manage a grocery store, if you ask my personal opinion. And so this really does not help matters whatsoever. Robin and I have had some guests on that have determined that these lands rights issues, the DRIPA issue, that it's not actually truly impacting decision making. That there's a bit of potential media hysteria over this. How do you react to those, that kind of thing?
Well, I think there's always a bit of hysteria around some things when there's change. But let's be honest, the hysteria is mainly online. People just going on about we're all going to lose our land and all lose our titles and stuff. I don't buy that hysteria, but I do buy the concern about uncertainty because you really can't get people to invest if they aren't certain. Now, some of these cases where a mine might be actually turned down by a First Nation, maybe over an environmental concern or whatever, and there may be more negotiations that can take place. There are really good examples of collaboration, consultation, accommodation for resources in British Columbia. The Red Chris mine is an example of one. Obviously, LNG Canada and up in the Terrace and Kitimat area is absolutely for sure one where people got together, they got the pipeline built, they got the the project built. And it was because people worked together and had that cooperative relationship. I don't think you can actually codify relationships into a piece of law that says you all have to behave this way. I think you have to have it so there's, as the courts had seen over the years, accommodation and revenue sharing, those type of things have come along as a result of it. And there's some very, very good deals and examples out there with between government, business, and First Nations communities across BC that are actually good examples of how we can make this work.
Now, we have different First Nations that purport to represent or be the voice of First Nations on the West Coast. There's a group that basically say that they are representing the coastal First Nations, and they say they're dead against all pipelines, and they've come out very strongly. And then it turns out they're heavily funded by organizations like the Rockefeller Organization in the States and other U.S. organizations dedicated to stopping the Canadian oil and gas industry in its tracks. I'm sure you're familiar with that. But at the same time, the national media seem to say, well, the First Nations are all against the oil and gas, and that's why this new pipeline and this new MOU between Carney and Alberta is outrageous and will never happen. You were able to get a deal done to get the pipeline through to Kitimat for the LNG. What do you see as the roadblocks ahead that are realistic as opposed to some of the fabrications that we're hearing about?
Well, I think we first of all should understand that it's easy to go find the negative validator if you want one. The fact of the matter is not all First Nations are opposed to economic development in the north and other areas of British Columbia, but you can always find the regulars that will come on and say we're opposed to all of this. And you're going to find them. And that's one of the mistakes I think our national media particularly makes, and our own media in BC, particularly our mainstream television. Well, I find the media thinks that they know what's going on and decide to make a decision as to what is going to be. They go find some validator somewhere that'll always come out negative and take that. Oh, all First Nations are opposed to this because this person from the coastal First Nation purports to speak for all of the multiple bands and communities up the coast and across the north of BC, and they don't. They don't speak for those people. I had calls after that MOU signed from former chiefs that had been around for a long time, said, we're not opposed. You know that, right? We will work as we did with you. We'll work with other people if it benefits our communities. So we're not going to say no. So those people don't speak for us, right? And you'll get that a lot. And the reality is that if you get on the ground with people that actually go into communities and sit down with First Nations, talk about the economic benefits and opportunities, talk about the partnerships and what can happen here, and actually build a consensus across a route or whatever, I think you can do it. And it's been done. A guy named Ian Anderson, who used to be the president of Trans Mountain Pipeline, he went to every single community from all the way up from Fort McMurray all the way down to the coast of British Columbia and went in there personally, gave them the respect they deserve, didn't send in some secondary person to have a conversation with them. And I know that because I was the approving officer, one of the two, myself and Mary Polak, on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And when it got to my desk, I read every letter from every First Nation community. And the media will never say this, but there were only three that were kind of opposed to it, and that was the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish down at the coast. All the way down that route, they had letters of support for that project, and they had come to accommodation, and those things happened. So when they start to say it can't happen, it reminds me of 2012, when I was made the Minister of Energy, Mines, and Natural Gas. And I went to conferences, and they said, BC will never get this done. It'll take you decades. I was told we would never get it done for LNG in Canada, told I would never be able to get consensus from the First Nations, which I took on. I had to take that on personally and go visit each one of those communities and work with them and their leadership. So what happened? We just ignored the noise. And in 6 years, we went from start to a $40 billion capital investment in British Columbia in LNG, which is now going to grow to another 2 trains. And it actually set the format for wood fiber and Squamish and the other LNG things that are going to come to this province. So if you sit there and listen to somebody and say, oh, they're all opposed, when they don't really know because that one spokesman doesn't necessarily speak for everybody, you're going to make a big mistake. You need to get on the ground.
But the line in the sand, that's being drawn, Rich, the line in the sand that's being drawn right now, isn't it about tankers? Even the Premier, well, we can't have those tankers, and Hecate Strait's a dangerous place for us to have tankers operating. And that was the objection, I think, of the Tsleil-Waututh and the Squamish as well, was the tanker traffic going out of Vancouver Harbor. So is that not the line they're trying to draw now? It's no longer the
I believe
more the outcome.
I think they should take a breath. Find out when they go and look for sites on the West Coast for something like this to happen. Maybe there's a site that doesn't have to go near the Hecate Strait. It's possible. So there are things that can be worked out as you come through this, but you don't quit just because somebody has a negative comment at day one. If we'd done that in 2012, we wouldn't have LNG Canada today.
Well, I have no faith in the NDP's ability to generate economic development. I've made that very clear. I don't know what's going to happen. My only my only faith would be that potentially after an election, we have a government that might be able to do economic development a tad bit better. However, that government does not seem to be a government in waiting. Tell me about what is going on the right in
So
province of British Columbia.
let me tell you, I totally agree that they can't do economic development. And I have an idea for forestry, I have ideas for things I've shared with people. But the bottom line is these are not business people and they're not visionaries and they're stuck in the mud. And so they can't figure out how to do economic development. They just keep stubbing their toe and messing it up. The challenge is you're correct about the other piece. You know, for the last year, we've had a opposition party that is, for lack of a better description, completely messed up. It's dysfunctional. People haven't learned their jobs. They don't do the critic roles well. They haven't had good leadership on the management side to teach them what it is to do, be a member of the legislature and do their job there. At the meantime, the leader who inherited, it was just him and one other person in the BC Conservatives, inherited a party with a whole bunch of nominated candidates that nobody knew because they were just given the job and appointed because they actually didn't think, probably coming into even July of last year, that they would even get close to having maybe 10 seats. And all of a sudden they're on the cusp of becoming a government. Then you put them all in a room and they have different ideas, different positions, different social issues as well in one room with no discipline and no understanding that how they become a team. And it doesn't matter who the leader would be, they're caught with one day having somebody in front of a camera going on about something to do with Indigenous people, and the next day it's some other issue to do with something else. All things that really haven't been discussed in the caucus, and he's got the microphone in front of his face trying to figure out how to defend his team and keep them together. It's a big job. And I think John Rustad tried valiantly there, and now, you know, and he got them to where they are. They have now had the crash and burn, which is the leader has left. They're going to have a leadership. The crash and burn actually gives them time to heal all wounds or some wounds, because they really are, some of them are pretty ticked off at each other. But it is over the next number of months will they do a leadership, and maybe they'll learn, they'll also realize that they weren't sent there to be one issue trick ponies on behalf of the votes of the people in their constituency. Maybe they were sent there to care about whether the mills are closing in 100 Mile House or Crofton. Maybe they were there sent there to figure out how they could debate the government and hold it to account and push it towards, you know, what it would be to look like the future of British Columbia with economic development, jobs, and opportunity for my children and my grandchildren. And if they do that, they might get there. But they're only going to get there by doing that. And the first thing they have to do is decide what they're there for. And believe me, people in this province, doesn't matter what riding you in today, are saying, I want a government in waiting, somebody I can look towards and I can give me some vision and future for my future of my province. And right now, all I can see is debt, taxes, inflation, you know, the falling off of the economy, and nobody's doing anything about it. And the clowns that are there are running around putting legislation out, like the unripped stuff, where they, I don't think they thought it well enough through, and I think they could go improve that, and they should, you know. So people are sitting there going, what now? You know, where do I go to have the future that I want in this province?
But they have the narrowest of votes in the legislature. I mean, there's, what is it, a two seat majority or something? So if the Conservatives were able to get a strong leader, you would think they'd be able to really make a very strong case to take government control again after quite some time that the NDP's been in power. It's been actually pretty well a decade, I guess, now that we've had an NDP government in place.
It has.
We've had a couple of people suggested as leaders that might come in from the outside. I don't know what you think of the name of James Moore coming in and taking a poke. Or so I see Aaron Gunn, the MP up in Pell Rivers, talking about how he'd like to come back and be the leader. I mean, so would it need to be somebody from inside? Should it be somebody from the outside, like a Gordon Campbell type of situation? Or does it need to be somebody from the inside who already knows where all the bodies are buried? I mean, what's your feeling when they have to make a quick turnaround with leadership?
Well, let me give you my description of what they need. How's that?
Yeah.
Could be from inside, could be from outside. I need someone that can come in and establish a bit of a statesman-like status in a relationship with the media and in the opposition as being a leader, it's a premier in waiting that can do that job. I need somebody that actually understands what the job is. I need somebody that know if somebody was running for leader today and they asked me for advice, I'd say, well, first thing you should do is you should sit down and call every one of your 39 members of the legislature personally. Whether you're in the caucus or out of the caucus, phone them personally, get their feelings, talk about where they would like to go in the future, and let them be part of your tent and come in. Secondly, start phoning each one of the ridings and making a connection with them, because this party is very weak on the ground and is going to need a real grassroots support to actually get it to where it's going to get to next. You have to bring in some people that can handle policy and direction and discipline and operation of a caucus. You can't be loosey-goosey, because you have to reboot this thing to look like a professional caucus, like a government in waiting. And we lived through that. And you may not remember, but in 1997, the BC Liberals had a very uncomfortable session. And we had guys, we were undisciplined, and we had people saying things that embarrassed our leader and what have you. And we went into a retreat and sat down, brought in a facilitator, and got our act together. And our act together was, we're going to focus on the things that are important for BC: lower taxes, jobs, economy, education, healthcare. That's who we are. We're not going off in a bunch of other tangents. And if you have a social issue in that caucus, you had a right to a free vote. So you could have a personal moral issue, but you didn't have to go out like on Twitter or Facebook, which we fortunately didn't have back then. But you could have the ability to speak to things and not upset the apple cart of the focus of the BC Liberal caucus to get the government and turn BC around. And that's very, very important. And what we had was a rule, no surprises. So you had an issue about a piece of legislation, you had an issue you really wound up about, you tell the caucus, and we'd work together to work through the issue with each other. That's how you do it, It's
but you need a leader, though, don't you? Don't you need a strong leader? Don't you have to find somebody who can lead all of that?
I do. That's right. But what I described is statesman-like, has the ability to look like a premier in waiting, but also understands the grassroots build of his team and his management and his caucus to bring them together as a team to go to work together to win an election.
But you're not going to name a name for us, eh? Who are you talking about? Who are you talking about, Rich? You can name a name, can't you?
I'm not naming a name because I know the names you guys just used, and I know the other names some of the names that are already decided that they're going to take a run at it. There's some pretty good people out there. Can they rise to the occasion? I don't know, because I think the first occasion is, can you bring that dispirited group together enough to get them to decide they're actually going to focus on what's important? And that is the job that they were sent there to do. They were sent there to do by the people who elected them to be an MLA for all the people in the riding on all issues. They were sent there to work on behalf of British Columbians. And now that they're the official opposition, they're also sent there to give the people of BC an option when there's another election to being called, to who they want to be government in BC.
But the other thing, Rich, the other thing is that the leadership thing has to happen so quickly, and it would be great if they could get sage advice from you. I remember we had you on a show, last show, I think it was, you mentioned that you'd never been asked by John Rustad or his group for advice or what they might do in terms of strategy going forward. Are you getting phone calls now? Are people calling up Rich Coleman to say, hey, Rich?
I've had a few phone calls. Yeah, I've had a few phone calls. But, I think it's really early and they don't even know the rules yet. And I think they're all sort of floating out there trying to figure out what they're doing. But there have been teams put together for campaigns for some people that are either have decided or are going to decide to run for leader. And Rich, that's their job.
I might be incorrect in this, so I stand to be corrected. But there seems to be a structural difference this time around, as opposed to the scenario that you reflected on late 90s. That being that a couple of parties have already established themselves, or at least one. And so to bring everyone together would actually mean these parties would have to dissolve. So it doesn't seem as easy as not as easy, as practical as it might be in the past.
Well, it's going to be harder on the main caucus, the BC Conservative Caucus, because of the dysfunction and obviously some of the issues that have gone between these people. But let's take a step back on that. I think they could actually figure it out, because I think once you've had a really bad experience, which they've obviously had with 2 sessions, you tend to look inside and say, how do we do this better? Because I don't think this is fun anymore. So let's figure out how to make this work. The biggest piece, and you say that we got different parties, but you have to remember that in 1996, when we became the opposition, we had the Reform Party of BC with a couple members. And it took time and work, talked to them. We actually moderated some of our stances on some issues to work with them. And Jack Weisgerber decided not to run again, but he was very supportive of us through that period. And Richard Neufeld came and joined us and ran with us and had a good career with us and then became a senator. So, it's about, again, the dialogue and having people who have the ability to build those bridges. And that's what it takes with a very good leader. And the leader is going to need some lieutenants that are also helpful as well, that can also go across the province and build bridges.
I'm going to end my questions with this question. Seeing you're talking about building bridges, we just had an announcement of the new replacement for the Patello Bridge that's going to go from New Westminster into Surrey, and it's been given a First Nations name that no one really can pronounce, which translates into Riverview. What do you think of this general move towards renaming things in First Nations names? I don't have as much of a problem with it if there is a pronounceable way of getting around it. But like as you drive around Scotland or Ireland, they often have signs with the name of a place, and they'll have in tiny letters above it what it would say in Gaelic. And of course, most people don't read Gaelic in Ireland or Scotland, but they like the fact there's that tradition. So I'm not as troubled by seeing it, although, of course, First Nations never had a real written language. But what do you make of this whole movement about renaming things and changing? Is it really part of reconciliation in your mind?
Well, first of all, take a breath, right? In BC, drive up the highway to Whistler. During the Olympics, there were second names of every river, creek, whatever, put on signs all the way up there in cooperation with the First Nations who sat with us and worked with us on the Olympics. I just can't get that fussed about this, because, even my hometown, Penticton, is actually Penticton or something like that, is a First Nations name for that city, and that is around in a lot of names in BC are names that are actually been anglicized from First Nations language. With the bridge itself, it is a tough name to pronounce, and what'll probably happen is it'll probably get a shortened nickname by somebody that'll get used by a lot of people because it's harder to say. Other people will get used to it, but I just can't get that wound up about that one, because I grew up in Penticton, and half my school was kids from the Penticton Indian Reserve, and the school I was from grades 1 to 7. And I used to ride my bike out there and fish with them and play ball with them and hang around their houses, and vice versa. And so I don't get this piece where people get wound up about names, because
I only do, Rich, because I feel we're sometimes throwing out our collective heritage for one heritage. And I don't dispute that there should be First Nations names where they're appropriate. I just wonder about Patello was once the premier of the province, and we ripped down Sir John A. Macdonald's statue, and they tore down Captain Cook in Victoria Harbor. I don't like that very much.
I don't agree with any of that either, right? I just think that what happens is sometimes when people get on a movement and the pendulum swings the ways over, and I believe it will eventually come back in balance, because our history is our history of all of us, and our history is to be respected by all of us. And a lot of my First Nations friends do respect that, and even though, but they are playing a bit of catch up too on respect and reconciliation and some of the things that they had to endure as a culture because of our coming here. So there's a balance, and I think it'll come back to a balance. Some people get very wound up and say it's like it's the end of the world or something, but I can't. I just think that we as a society and as human beings will strike a balance over time, and this will come back, the pendulum will come back, and we'll be fine together if we're respectful of each other and we listen to each other and we work with each other.
I'm voting for Rich. I have a final question for you that might generate more questions. Okay. So I've been frustrated over, let's say, the past 2-3 months with our Conservative Prime Minister, Mark Carney, and not seeing enough results. And those results seem to now be coming up. We're now sort of starting to see some of the results of his work. Okay, let's shift to the right. What are you hearing about what's happening on the Conservative side? We've had a lot of comments lately on our broadcasts and from our guests about, is Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives going through maybe a little bit less noise, but are going through the same process of what's happening in BC on the right?
And I think anytime, and remember in 1996, we were supposed to be government, right? I mean, we got the popular vote, we didn't win, right? And that brings this period of reflection no matter what party you're in. So they're going through that, and at the same time trying to establish themselves, given the change in personality in the Prime Minister's office, because if they ran against Trudeau, they would have won the election. The change to Carney was just enough of a shift to get the anger of Trudeau out of the equation, so the Liberals could make a move, and then the collapse of the NDP. They have a convention in January in Calgary where they do have a leadership review, where they will have that will take place. That's standard practice after an election for them, and that convention is going to do that, and then you'll see how it shakes out at this point in time. I mean, he did get the most votes and seats that the Conservatives got in a very long time, and but at the same time they have to find themselves a way to adjust from the fact that they really thought they were, going to be government, and now aren't. And now you have this you'll always have some internal grumblings. Well, what mistakes did they make, and what mistakes didn't they make? And I think they made some mistakes on the grassroots myself on the selection of candidates and things like that. But they've always sort of stumbled on that one, in my opinion. So I think I think January will be interesting.
Talking about shifting, that is one of the consistent threads through the online dialogue and even some of the more traditional dialogue, is that in fact Poilievre can't shift from being mad and angry and an opposition leader. And that is sort of a maturity that needs to happen, that in fact is reflected in many of your comments, this sort of statesman-like profile that he doesn't seem to be able to get to. Do you think that can happen?
Well, I thought he was getting there before the election. I mean, elections are always, as you know, combative. And then coming out of that and into the groove when you've got to sit in the House and deal with stuff internally. I don't know how anybody does it.
I think he had his whole platform pulled out from under him when Donald Trump came in and started talking about Canada as the 51st state and all these tariffs, and the election suddenly became Donald Trump. And it seemed to me that Poilievre didn't react to that very quickly. Like he wanted to keep talking about the Liberal mismanagement and all that. And Carney became the hero in Canada in terms of standing up to Trump, and people gave him the keys to the car.
Well, I think there's something to that, Robin. I mean, the reality is that they thought they were running against Trudeau, and they weren't in the end. Now, I had told many of them that when I bumped into them, I'd say, you're not going to run against Trudeau, right? So you need to shift, have your messaging so it's more broader, because you're not going to be it's not going to be personality on personality, right? And then you're right. I mean, the whole thing with the 51st state and the tariffs and stuff and the fear that it brought to the country. I think the country shifted from disappointment and anger and upset with Trudeau to saying, who can actually be calm through this storm we're about to go through? And I think Carney actually slipped very well into that, the calm thing. However, I haven't seen any productivity on things other than a few MOUs that have been signed. So the jury's out whether he can actually build Canada. But the reality is he's got a slim minority in Ottawa. And he needs to produce. because people are getting more and more scared and worried. The tariffs are having their effect. Inflation is it. Talk to anybody, meet, you must run into this yourselves. What the cost of food is. I get it from my own children and their friends about how things have gone up. And they're worried about obviously jobs, businesses, how are they going to do in this downward trend of an economy? Are we going to be moving away from BC to find the work because there's nothing happening here? That's the attitude. And that's a bad attitude. And I think one of the things that I've always said that one of the things kind of like the canary in the coal mine in the economy, and we saw this in the 90s and we're seeing it now, is youth unemployment. Youth unemployment is high. And everybody, whether it be a grandparent or a parent, are right now looking at a kid that might be coming out of grade 12 this year, thinking about going to school or going for a trade, going for a job. And they're not seeing the opportunities because of the level of youth unemployment that were when the BC Liberals were in government. But you have to remember, the highest point in time of youth unemployment before right now was during the NDP of the 90s. And it was one of the things that really worried people then. And it was why I got involved in politics at the provincial level, because I wanted to have a place where my kids could have the choice of having a career and job and raising a family in BC. And now I'm hearing more and more of them talking about how cheaper it is to have a home in Alberta or some other place, and where there are jobs in these other provinces of Canada and elsewhere in the world. And that bugs me a lot.
On that happy note, Rich, we're going to thank you and wish you a very Merry Christmas. Great to have you rumbling with us. I think we had to push you into rumbling a little bit there. You're such a diplomat now as an elder statesman. I think the combative Rich Coleman is there. I know the Rich Coleman that I've always known is there wanting to punch out a little bit, but I really appreciate the fact you're more measured.
I'll give you a closing shot. You probably won't use it. Okay, but I'll give you one. All right. Because I think these guys are so weak in BC as a government. So all of a sudden you're getting mills closed and you can't get fiber to mills. You can't get fiber to anywhere, right? Some guy decides to raise the countervailing duty named Trump across the border to you, and it's a woe is me environment. So my answer to this was this, and I gave it to people and nobody's brought it up, but I have said it. Look at it. They're going to tariff you. You pass the argument about whether you subsidize your lumber. It's a resource of British Columbia for the people of British Columbia. You have hundreds and maybe thousands of cutting permits sitting there because your bureaucracy can't get their job done. So you can't cut the wood. But when you try to cut the wood, you can't make any money because it's too expensive, because the NDP changed the stumpage system, how much they charge money, to where they're actually, it's too expensive to get a log out of the woods. So do this. Tell your people in 60 days, all cutting permits have got to be approved, and take stumpage to zero. Quit collecting it. Say it's free. It's going to zero. 3,000 people will go to work in the forest. They will pay income tax. You're going to get your money back. The economy is going to turn, and those guys will be able to sell that lumber in the U.S. competitively, because if their housing starts moving, if they don't, you don't. But then you have other customers you can discount to: China, Europe, Japan, and put some faith in the people of British Columbia to drive the economy, rather than being the people that are in the way of the economy for permitting and everything else. You can't get anything built here. That's just and I could go
That's
on.
the Rich Coleman we love. So,
Rich, I want to say happy holiday, Merry Christmas, and I'm voting for Rich Coleman.
No, I'm yesterday's
and
guy.
rumble on.
We all know I'm yesterday's man, but I do love having the chance to chat about it and express my opinion to you guys from time to time.
And we're so pleased to have you on, Rich. We'll do this again in the new year. So on that note, rumble on and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you guys too. Have a good one.